Unless you're living under a rock, you've probably heard about how President Trump has fired FBI Director James Comey. Now, the reason why I say everyone and their dog has heard about this story is because the mainstream media has been covering it non-stop. Now, there's a lot of confusion around the story, and the details, everything is so convoluted that I don't know how to characterize this as anything other than a complete clusterfuck. And for people who are genuinely confused, you're not alone, because when it comes to how we should feel or how people think we should feel about this story, well, nobody knows, because both parties have been on opposite sides and then flipped multiple times when it comes to James Comey. And I think the perfect example of this is how Stephen Colbert actually announced on his show that James Comey was fired, and then the crowd cheered, and then he basically had to say, you know what, we should probably calm down, and basically implied that they shouldn't be excited about this. So nobody really knows what's going on, and there's a lot of people within the mainstream media that has come to conclusions about this, but anyone who is claiming to have the answers, they don't. Everything, all talks about this, it's just speculative at this point because we don't know. So my goal is to kind of break down for you how both parties view James Comey and how they flipped on multiple occasions, and figure out what exactly might be going on, because again, we don't have the answers. And that's okay. We don't have to come to a decisive opinion. We can just acknowledge that, the details are messy and we could wrestle with it later. But for now, I think it's important that we get the information out there. And if you don't come away from this segment hating both Republicans and Democrats even more, then I don't think I did my job explaining this adequately, because this has just been such a mess. Now, the biggest question is, why would Donald Trump choose to fire James Comey of all times? Now, there's a story relating to this one that prior to James Comey's firing, just a couple days prior actually, Comey had asked for more funds to investigate Donald Trump's potential ties with Russia. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump decided to fire him. Donald Trump, if he fired James Comey because he was being investigated by James Comey, well, that's just an abuse of power. So when it comes to Donald Trump firing James Comey, is this a problem? Well, potentially, because obviously if you are a government official and you fire someone who's investigating you, regardless of how frivolous you feel that investigation is, that's an abuse of power. You can't really cut it any other way. It's suspicious. It makes you look guilty. Problem is that it's difficult to determine whether or not Donald Trump actually knew that James Comey was investigating him, because in his letter, he reiterated that James Comey wasn't investigating him. But James Comey was, in fact, investigating Donald Trump for potential collusion with Russia. Now, look, I've been someone who I'm not on board with the Trump-Russia collusion story, one, because we have yet to see any concrete evidence that Donald Trump has colluded with Russia. And furthermore, if we can find evidence that Donald Trump did work with the Russians to release John Podesta and the DNC's emails to WikiLeaks, I don't think that that's tantamount to trying to rig an election. What they did was release information exposing how Hillary Clinton rigged the election. So unless you could find evidence that Donald Trump worked with Russians to hack voting booths or something, I just don't see how that's a persuasive argument. But regardless, even if I'm not on board with the Russia collusion story and I don't find it persuasive and I don't see any evidence as of yet, this seemed like an impulsive reaction. And rather than playing it cool, if you were being investigated, what's the one thing that you want to do? You want to make it seem as though, this investigation will lead nowhere, right? But rather than doing that, Donald Trump decided to fire James Comey. And what he did was give Democrats this present right now. And he's giving them a huge opportunity to ramp up this Russian hysteria even more. And if you think that this is the smoking gun, it may not necessarily be the case that it has anything to do with Russia, because Donald Trump, he's a corrupt businessman with ties to countries all around the world, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. So it may not be the case that they found evidence of, Trump-Russia collusion. Perhaps James Comey found evidence that Donald Trump govern in a way that would benefit his businesses. And I've already talked about on the show how that is in fact the case. So while investigating Donald Trump, it could have been the case that James Comey found something else. We have no way of knowing, but Donald Trump shouldn't have freaked out, because we know that James Comey doesn't like to hold the elites and the powerful accountable, because, during his tenure as FBI director, the FBI has prosecuted people for doing less than what Hillary Clinton did, but yet he failed to indict her, even though he admits that she mishandled classified information. So there's just so much details that makes this a really messy story, and it's difficult to come away with any concrete conclusions other than the fact that both sides are being opportunistic. Donald Trump, he's just not playing his cards right. He's being incredibly dumb, and he's fanning the flames of any Russia conspiracy that the Democrats are trying to put forward. And Democrats are being opportunistic because they're going to now use this as a distraction from the fact that they have nothing to offer voters. So let me just give you a recap as to how many times both parties have flipped. So first, Democrats disliked James Comey because he was investigating Hillary Clinton, and Republicans loved him because he was investigating Hillary Clinton. Now, both sides changed their positions when James Comey announced that he would not be indicting Hillary Clinton. So at that point, Democrats praised him and thought that he conducted a fair investigation, and then Republicans thought that he wasn't fair and that he was being partial towards Hillary Clinton. Now, objectively speaking, if you were angry at the fact that James Comey chose not to indict Hillary Clinton after he admitted that she was extremely careless in her handling of classified information, especially when you know that the FBI was hard and penalized people for doing the same thing that Hillary Clinton did, then I think you were right to be angry with James Comey. But the anger that Republicans felt towards James Comey was not justified, because they didn't care about justice. They weren't outraged that James Comey basically demonstrated how we live in a two-tiered justice system where the poor get penalized when they commit crimes, but the elites get away with it. They were just outraged because they were partisan hacks, and they wanted James Comey to indict Hillary Clinton. But for those of us who are progressive, we were frustrated with James Comey because he showed that he is willing to allow elites to get away with doing the same things that poor people do that he has prosecuted them for, Navy officials. So it was unjust what he did. Brian Nishimura, who did not intend to distribute classified information, was penalized under the leadership of James Comey at the FBI. However, the position of Democrats and Republicans changed once again when Comey released his letter in late October, which stated that he would be reopening the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails. Now, at this point, Democrats hated him and called for him to resign, while Republicans loved him again. In fact, Hillary Clinton literally blamed him for her loss, but now, since Donald Trump fired him, both parties have flipped yet again, and now Democrats disagree with his firing while Republicans are in favor of it. So both sides have been completely inconsistent, and after watching all of this unfold, I'm not sympathetic to either side, because both Republicans and Democrats have both exposed themselves as hypocrites and political opportunists, both of which have praised and lambasted Comey, depending on whether or not it was politically expedient for them to do so at a particular period of time. And now both parties are acting very reprehensible. They're being partisan hacks when it comes to the firing of James Comey, because we have Donald Trump, who, again, it looks as though this is an abuse of power if he did in fact know that James Comey was investigating him. But again, he's dumb, so we can't necessarily say that with certainty. If you fire someone who's investigating you, you just can't do that. Objectively speaking, you can't do that. We'd call out Democrats if they did that. We'd call out Republicans if, they did something like that. And certainly we need to call out Donald Trump if he did in fact do something like that. And, he claims to have fired Comey upon the recommendation of the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General. But again, there's a huge question. Why would they only recommend that he do this now? So that's an open question, and we don't have the answer to it. Now, also, what Democrats are going to do with all of this, and what we've already seen, is that they're being opportunistic. They're using this to ramp up Russian hysteria and attack Donald Trump on this. And they kind of look at this as the smoking gun, and they say it seems as though Comey was about to uncover evidence that Donald Trump colluded with Russia to tip the scales against Hillary Clinton. But again, if all you're going to bring me is evidence that Donald Trump colluded with Russia to release the WikiLeaks emails of John Podesta and the DNC, I don't think that is tantamount to election hacking, because before the election, what were we told by the media? That there was nothing here. I mean, the Daily Beast literally said that WikiLeaks trolled the world by releasing nothing on Hillary Clinton, and when she lost, Democrats were desperate to try to pin blame on her loss on anything. So then they started to blame WikiLeaks when before the election they claimed it wasn't a problem. So unless you could bring me evidence, like I said, not to be redundant, that Donald Trump worked with Vladimir Putin and Russia to rig the actual elections or the election machines where you vote, I don't think you can make that case, because we always spy on our allies. We always are interested in the affairs of elections. You can make the argument that President Obama's endorsement of Macron in France was him trying to tip the scales against Le Pen. We always do this, so I don't find that persuasive. However, Donald Trump just handed Democrats a big gift, because now they're going to use this as an opportunity to ramp up Russian hysteria, and it's just never going to end, and this distraction will continue. Meanwhile, actual important issues in the country will continue to be ignored, and I find that incredibly disheartening. So, I mean, in sum, our government is stacked with opportunistic idiots from top to bottom, and we shouldn't let this distract us from the real issues, but I'm not going to imply here that Comey is the victim, because he's a coward. And, you know, the irony in all of this is that if he actually would have done his job and held Hillary Clinton to the same standard that he held other people to, who he prosecuted for doing what she did, then he would still have his job. Because if Hillary Clinton was indicted, or if he recommended to the Justice Department that she be indicted, then she would have been forced to drop out of the race. Bernie Sanders would have become the Democratic Party's nominee, and then he would have defeated Donald Trump, and James Comey would still have his job. So, you know, after seeing all of this unfold, both parties are just, they're egregious. They have no principles, and they're all opportunistic assholes who don't really care about us. And this distraction is going on while the real issues are continuing to get ignored. So again, we don't have all of the details. This is, you know, the waters are so muddied at this point that we can't really decipher what's actually going on. But what we do know is that it's convoluted. The story is complex. You don't have to take a side. Don't feel pressure to take a side, or come to a conclusion that you know what's going on based on, you know, the pontification in the mainstream media, because they don't know what's going on. Everything is all speculative, and at this point, the story is so unclear that anyone can take any narrative that they've been championing and apply it to the story, and it might look like it fits. So in the end, we don't know what's going on, but what we do know is that this is distracting us from the real issues. And nobody's innocent here. James Comey, Donald Trump, the Democrats, they all should be ashamed of themselves for the way that they handled this situation and currently are handling the situation. Here's what I'll end with. I think that since Donald Trump did, in fact, decide to fire James Comey while he was under investigation by him, now it is time for us to appoint an independent investigator to figure out what's going on, because you can't do that. We have to get to the bottom of this as to whether or not Donald Trump did in fact commit an abuse of power. And I think it's, you know, it's perfectly reasonable to want an independent prosecutor to look into Donald Trump. So I'm always going to err on the side of more information and not less. But with that being said, I want my fellow liberals to not be so fixated on Russia. Broaden this out. Donald Trump, he has his hands in cookie jars across the world. So if you're thinking that Russia may be the only thing that, you know, James Comey finds, again, Donald Trump has businesses in many countries. So it could be broader than that. But I think that there's one conclusion that we can all take away from this. You know, Donald Trump had nothing to worry about with Comey, because again, Comey showed that he is not willing to hold the rich and the elites accountable to the extent that he holds, you know, normal Americans accountable. So Donald Trump had nothing to worry about. The biggest thing that I want to emphasize is that we can't get caught up on this. There's an attack on net neutrality right now. There is a push for Medicare for all that the Democratic Party doesn't want to focus on. There's a lot that can bog us down, but I don't want that to happen. I want us to acknowledge what's happening, try to get to the bottom of it, and then get to the real issues.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.